The last thing Arabella Ashford felt before the darkness took her was the cold. I'm not talking about the cold of the October air that had been biting at her cheeks since they left the inn at Matlock, or the cold of the carriage window glass beneath her gloved fingers. This was a different kind of cold entirely, the kind that reached inside a person and grabbed them by the spine, the cold of the ground no longer being where the ground was supposed to be. The carriage had hit something and began tilting upside down. She heard Nell scream, a short, sharp sound, cut off, and then the whole world turned sideways and Arabella was thrown against the door. A few seconds later, the door gave way and there was nothing there. Nothing beneath her feet, and the grey Derbyshire sky wheeled above her like something being poured out of a bowl, and she thought, with the peculiar clarity that arrives in the half-second before catastrophe, I never told him. Then the river came up to meet her. The cold swallowed her whole. And Arabella Ashford, Duchess of Pembrooke, ceased to exist.
Welcome to the Duchess Library, where every page holds a treasure. If you are new, and you love Regency romance with real jaw-dropping drama, real heartbreak, and the kind of twists that make you grip your seat, welcome. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and share this with someone who needs a story worth staying up for. Now back to the story.
6 years later, October, 1816. The bread always burned slightly on the left side of the pan. Arabella, who went by Agnes in this life, Agnes Holloway, widow, tenant, mother, had learned to watch for it. She turned the loaf before it could tip past golden into black, the way she had learned to watch for everything since the Holloways pulled her from the riverbed. You watched. You adjusted. You did not wait for things to fix themselves, because things did not fix themselves. That much she knew, even if she could not have told you how she knew it. The farmhouse kitchen was warm in the way that only kitchens with wood-fired ranges and stone floors and low ceilings could be warm, a warmth that had weight to it, that pressed against you gently from all sides. Outside the small window above the wash-basin, the Derbyshire hills were going the colour of rust and amber, the last of the summer heat bleeding out of the trees. Agnes watched the hills while the bread cooled and thought, as she often did in these quiet morning moments, about nothing at all. She was rather skilled at thinking about nothing at all. It had taken practice. Mamma. The voice came from somewhere near her left knee. She looked down. Edmund stood beside her in his stocking feet. He had abandoned his boots somewhere between the yard and the kitchen, as he abandoned everything he considered unnecessary, with his wooden horse tucked under one arm and a look of tremendous gravity on his 5-year-old face. Captain says he's hungry. Captain, Agnes said, had oats this morning, the same as you. He says oats aren't enough. Then Captain and I are in agreement on something. Edmund considered this. He had a way of considering things, tilting his head, pressing his lips together, that Agnes had long since stopped being able to explain. It was not a Holloway expression. None of the Holloways held their faces that way. She had assumed, in the early years, that it came from her. But looking at him now, at the serious set of his jaw and those pale, pale eyes that no amount of summer sun ever seemed to darken, she was less certain of everything she had assumed. Mrs. Holloway says there's a market today, Edmund announced, clearly deciding that the captain debate was resolved in his favour. She says I can come. She told me the same. Go find your boots. I know where my boots are. Where are they? A pause. Somewhere near the gate. Edmund. He went, with the particular gait of a small boy who has decided that retreating is not the same as admitting defeat. Agnes allowed herself a smile. Only once he was gone, she was careful about that. She was careful about a great many things. Mrs. Dorothy Holloway appeared in the kitchen doorway with a basket over each arm and the expression of a woman who had already completed 4 tasks before anyone else in the house had opened their eyes. She was 60 years old and built like something permanent, with white hair coiled around her head and hands that had done more honest work than most men Agnes had ever encountered. She set both baskets on the table, looked at the bread, looked at Agnes, and said nothing. She often communicated most clearly when she said nothing. The left side is fine, Agnes said. I caught it. I didn't say a word. You have a loud face. Mrs. Holloway picked up the bread, turned it over, examined the bottom, and set it back down. It's fine, she agreed, with the particular tone of someone conceding a point they hadn't officially made. She began loading the baskets. "The Birkett boy will drive us in the cart. Edmund's coming. Try stopping him. Wouldn't dream of it." She tucked a cloth over the top of the nearest basket. "Agnes." Something in the way she said the name made Agnes look up properly. Mrs. Holloway was watching her with that look, the sharp, fond, slightly worried look that Agnes had come to recognize over 6 years as the expression of a woman who knew more than she said. "You slept poorly again." It was not a question. Agnes had given up being surprised by how little escaped this woman. "I dreamed." The same dream. A version of it. She picked up a cloth and folded it, needing something to do with her hands. "The grey-eyed man again. A house I don't recognize. White roses." She folded the cloth a second time. "It means nothing." Mrs. Holloway said nothing. Her face said considerably more. "It means nothing," Agnes repeated, with slightly less conviction. The older woman picked up her baskets. "Cart leaves in half an hour. Tell that boy to find his boots." The village market sprawled across the cobblestones of the main square every third Saturday of October, the same as it had for 300 years, and it was, in Agnes's considered opinion, one of the genuinely good things about this life. She liked the noise of it, the smell of it, apples and wood smoke and horse, and the particular sharp sweetness of the cheesemonger who always set up beside the well. She liked having somewhere to be that was not the farm. She liked watching people. Edmund did not like watching people. He liked being among them, pushing through gaps, appearing unexpectedly beside strangers' legs, conducting detailed examinations of anything that caught his eye. Agnes kept half her attention on him at all times, which was both exhausting and, she had come to understand, exactly the shape that love took. She was standing at the flower stall when she found the roses. White ones. Not perfect hothouse roses, late-season ones, slightly blown, petals loosening at the edges, the kind of flower that had decided to be beautiful despite everything the autumn had thrown at it. Agnes picked up a stem and stood holding it and felt, for no reason she could name, that she had been here before. Not at this stall. Not at this market. But holding this exact flower, in this exact weight of October air, with this exact sensation of being on the edge of something she could not see. She put the rose down. Picked it up again. Paid for it. She was still holding it when she heard the commotion. It started at the far end of the square, a shout, and then another, and then a sound that was less a sound and more a change in pressure, a collective intake of breath that swept through the market crowd like wind through tall grass. Agnes turned. The horse came around the corner of the chandler's shop at a full blind gallop, eyes white and rolling, a broken cart dragging and bouncing and scattering sparks behind it on the cobblestones. People scattered. A basket of apples went in all directions. Someone's child was snatched back by a parent a half-second before the animal's flank would have caught them. Agnes did not think. She dropped the rose, seized Edmund by the back of his coat, and pressed him flat against the wall of the nearest market stall, covering him with her body, turning her own face away from the oncoming wreckage. The cart wheel hit the edge of the stall post directly in front of her face and exploded. The sound of it, the crack of wood, the scream of the horse, the spinning, clattering impact of broken wheel on cobblestone, hit Agnes like something physical. Like a door she had been leaning against her whole life giving way all at once. She heard it and she was no longer in the market square. She was in a carriage. Rain. The smell of leather and something sweet. Chocolate. She had drunk chocolate that morning. It had tasted strange, and the road tilting and Nell's voice, one syllable, one awful syllable. The door. Cold air where the floor had been. The sky, wrong, moving wrong, and below her the grey rush of the river coming up fast, and she thought, Callum. Agnes's knees hit the cobblestones. She was aware of it distantly, the way you are aware of pain that has not caught up to you yet. Edmund was saying something. Mamma, mamma, his small hands pressed against her face, and the market was noise and confusion around them, but she was only barely inside any of it. Because behind her eyes the dam had given way and everything was coming through at once. A house. White roses in a garden. A man standing at the foot of a staircase looking up at her on the landing with an expression she had spent 6 years dreaming about and never been able to hold. Grey eyes. Dark hair. A jaw that could have been cut from Derbyshire stone. And a name. rising up through 6 years of silence like something that had been waiting at the bottom of very deep water. Callum Ashford. The Duke of Pembrooke. My husband. Mamma. Edmund's voice broke through. His hands were on her face, and she realized she was gripping him back, her arms wrapped around him, both of them on the ground in the middle of the market square. Mamma, you're scaring me. She pulled back and looked at him. She looked at him properly, in a way she realized she had been not quite doing for 5 years, skimming past the thing that sat in the middle of his face like a truth she had been too blank to read. Those eyes. January sky. Derbyshire stone. The exact shade of the eyes she had just seen behind her own, belonging to the man whose name had just cracked open the last 6 years of her life like an egg. Edmund, she said. Her voice was almost steady. Almost. I'm all right. I promise you I am all right. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead with a hand that shook only slightly. I just need a moment. Can you give me a moment? He studied her with that grave, unnerving look of his. Then he sat down beside her on the cobblestones, pressed his shoulder against hers, and held Captain up. You can hold Captain if you want, he offered. He helps. Agnes took the small carved horse, closed her fingers around it, breathed. Around them, the market slowly restabilized. Someone caught the cart horse. Someone else swept up the apples. Life resumed its ordinary shape. Agnes sat in the middle of it and let the memories come, because she understood now that there was no stopping them. They had been waiting 6 years for this crack in the door, and they were not going to be patient about it. By the time Mrs. Holloway found them, pushing through the last of the scattered crowd with her baskets still on her arms and her expression somewhere between alarm and the determined calm of a woman who has weathered worse, Agnes was on her feet. She had Edmund's hand in hers. Her face was white and set and her eyes were dry, because she had gone somewhere past the point where crying was available to her. I need to talk to you, Agnes said, before Mrs. Holloway could speak. Tonight. After Edmund is asleep. She paused. My name, she said slowly, as if testing the weight of it, is not Agnes. Mrs. Holloway went very still. Then she set down both baskets, reached out, and gripped Agnes by the arms with both hands. She looked at her the way she had looked at her the first morning, when Agnes had woken up in the Holloway spare room with no name and no past and nothing in her eyes but confusion and river water. Like she was measuring what was there now against what had been missing. All right, Mrs. Holloway said quietly. Tonight. After Edmund's asleep. She released her. Picked up the baskets. Come on then. Cart's waiting. Agnes, Arabella, walked back through the market with her son's hand in hers and the carved horse still pressed in her other fist and 6 years of someone else's life dissolving around her like morning frost. She did not look back at the white rose where she had dropped it on the cobblestones. She knew, now, why she had bought it. That night, Mrs. Holloway sat at the kitchen table and listened without a single interruption for the better part of an hour. She listened the way she did everything, completely, with her full attention, her broad hands flat on the table in front of her. The fire burned low. Edmund's soft, even breathing drifted down from the room above. When Arabella finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Are you certain? Mrs. Holloway asked. It was not doubt in her voice. It was the question of a woman who understood that the next thing said after yes could not be unsaid. Yes. No hesitation. I remember everything. The house. The marriage. The morning of the journey. Her hands wrapped around her tea mug. I remember giving Nell my locket. Her voice dropped slightly. She was wearing it when the carriage went over, wasn't she? He would have identified her by the locket. He would have thought. He thought you were dead, Mrs. Holloway said quietly. He thought I was dead. Arabella set the mug down. For 6 years. The fire shifted. A log dropped. And the boy. Mrs. Holloway said, even more quietly. Arabella looked at the ceiling, toward the room where Edmund slept. He is the Duke of Pembroke's legitimate son and heir, she said. He has his father's eyes. He has always had his father's eyes and she stopped. Pressed her lips together. Kept going. I didn't know. When the carriage went over, I didn't know I was carrying him yet. He was born in your spare room and I named him Edmund because it was the only name that felt right and I never knew why until tonight." "It was his grandfather's name," Arabella said. "The old Duke. Callum spoke of him sometimes." She looked at Mrs. Holloway directly. "I have to go back." Mrs. Holloway held her gaze. "I know. I'm not going back for myself. I don't," she paused, sorting through the tangle of what was true. "I don't know what I'm going back for. For myself. But Edmund deserves his name. He deserves his inheritance. I will not raise the heir to a dukedom in a—" She stopped herself. Looked around the kitchen. The warm stone walls. The burned on the left bread pan. The crack in the ceiling that Mr. Holloway had been meaning to fix for 3 years. Her eyes came back to Mrs. Holloway and something in her chest cracked open. "I don't mean it like that." "I know you don't." Mrs. Holloway reached across the table and covered Arabella's hand with hers. A hand that was large and rough and warm and had, 6 years ago, pulled an unconscious woman out of a swollen river and carried her inside without once asking whether the trouble was worth it. "I know exactly what you mean." Arabella turned her hand over and gripped the older woman's fingers hard. "I'm frightened," she admitted. It was the most honest thing she had said in 6 years. "He has had 6 years to become someone I don't know. And she looked down at their joined hands. "I'm not the woman he married. I don't know if she still exists." "She does," Mrs. Holloway said, with a certainty that left no room for argument. "She's been here the whole time. She just learned to make bread." She squeezed once, firm and decisive, and then released her hand and stood up. She crossed to the larder. She began taking things down from the shelf. A round of cheese. A wrapped parcel of dried meat. Half the remaining loaf, the unburned side. Arabella watched her. "What are you doing?" "Packing you bread for the road." Mrs. Holloway did not look up. "You'll want an early start. It's a fair walk to the Pembroke gatehouse from here, even with Thomas Burkitt driving you part of the way." Arabella sat at the kitchen table where she had made bread and sewed torn hems and listened to Edmund learn to talk and watched the seasons change through the small window above the wash basin, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened. She folded her hands in her lap. "I'll need to tell Edmund in the morning," she said. "Enough of it, anyway. Enough for him to understand where we're going. Children understand more than we tell them and less than we worry they will." Mrs. Holloway set the packed cloth on the table. She looked at Arabella with an expression that contained, compressed into the creases of her 60-year-old face, 6 years of quiet love. "Go get your life back, girl." Arabella did not sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to Edmund breathe and held in her hands, by memory, the face of a grey-eyed man she had thought was only a dream. And somewhere 40 miles to the south, in a shuttered house that smelled of locked rooms and unprocessed grief, a letter was being written that would change everything. But she did not know that yet. The letter came from Mr. Croft, solicitor, and it arrived on a Tuesday morning that was doing its level best to feel like the end of something. Callum read it standing up, still in his riding coat, having come in from an early morning ride that had been less about exercise and more about the fact that movement was the only thing that reliably kept his mind from going to places he had no business visiting at 8 in the morning. He read it once. Then he set it on his desk, walked to the window, stood with his hands behind his back, and looked out at the London street below, the delivery carts, the crossing sweeper, the woman with a red umbrella who appeared every Tuesday and walked exactly as far as the baker's and no further, and he read the letter again, without picking it up, from memory. The entailment, as previously discussed, will expire on the 14th of January. Should Pembroke Manor remain unoccupied and no legitimate heir be registered in residence before that date, the estate reverts in full to the Crown. I would counsel your Grace most strongly to consider. He stopped remembering it there. He had known about the entailment for a year. He had been not deciding about the entailment for a year, which was, he was aware, itself a kind of decision, the kind that comfortable men in large London townhouses could afford to keep making right up until they couldn't. 3 months. Croft was telling him he had 3 months. He could sell. The thought arrived the way it always did, flat and logical and immediately unbearable. He could sell Pembroke, take what the estate was worth, and never again have to consider what it cost him to think about walking those particular corridors. Simple. Clean. Final. He stood at the window for 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the church clock across the street move through them, one by one. Then he rang for his valet and told him to pack for Derbyshire. He did not explain why. He was not in the habit of explaining himself, and he was especially not in the habit of explaining the things he did not fully understand himself. He was going to Pembroke to decide if he could live there again. That was all. He was going alone, without the solicitor or the secretary or the small army of staff that accompanied a duke doing official business, because whatever was going to happen when he walked through that door was going to be private, and he intended to keep it that way. He left before dawn. He told no one. He did not think about the letter from Miss Honoria Bassett that was already on its way to his address, written and sealed and posted that same morning from a pleasant house in Bath, asking in her precise and pleasant way about the timing of her first visit to Pembroke. He did not think about it because he did not know it had been sent. He rode north into the dark and let the miles come. Thomas Birkett drove them as far as the Causton crossroads, for miles from the Pembroke Gatehouse Road, before he had to turn the cart back for the afternoon milking. He apologized twice about this. Arabella told him once that it was perfectly fine and meant it so clearly that he stopped apologizing. Edmund sat on the cartboard between them for the whole journey with his legs dangling and Captain pressed against his chest, watching the countryside pass with the attentive silence of someone gathering information. He had been like this since breakfast, when Arabella had sat across from him at the kitchen table and told him, in the most honest and least frightening words she could find, that she remembered who she was. That they had another home. That there was a man, his father, who did not know they were coming but who needed to know they existed. Edmund had eaten 3 bites of his porridge. He had looked at her with those grey eyes that she understood now with a clarity that was still almost too much to hold. "Is he nice?" Edmund had asked. Arabella had thought about that carefully, because she owed him a careful answer. "I believe he can be," she had said. Edmund had considered this for a moment. "Captain says we should go," he had announced, apparently consulting the wooden horse. "Captain says it's the right thing." Arabella had looked at the small carved horse and thought that whatever instinct lived behind those pale eyes, his father's instinct, the one that knew without being told, she was grateful for it. Now she walked the last 4 miles of Derbyshire Road with Edmund's hand in hers and the Holloway bread in a cloth bag over her shoulder and the October wind pressing against them both from the west, and she did not let herself think past the next step. The step after the step after the step. This was how you moved forward when the destination was something your whole body was afraid of. You made it very small. You made it just your feet and the road and your son's hand and the next step. The gatehouse came into view around a bend in the road just as the light was beginning to go long and copper, the way October light did in this part of England, as if the sun was trying to get one last good look before it gave up for the day. Arabella stopped. She had not let herself picture this. She had refused, the entire journey, to let herself picture arriving, because she knew that the gap between the picture and the reality was where people fell apart, and she could not afford to fall apart with a 5-year-old beside her. But she had not accounted for the way the sight of those stone gate posts, weathered and familiar, the iron slightly more rusted than she remembered, the Ashford crest still visible in the wrought work, would hit her square in the sternum like something thrown hard. "Mamma." Edmund pulled at her hand. She made herself breathe. "I'm all right." She was getting better at saying this and slightly better at meaning it. "Come on then." The gate was unlocked. She noticed that, filed it away without understanding why, and went through. The drive curved through the overgrown parkland the way she remembered, the elms taller now, the grass on either side gone wild and long, seed heads bowing in the wind. She had walked this drive in silk slippers on a summer morning 7 years ago, newly arrived and deeply uncertain and trying very hard not to show it. She walked it now in plain boots that had seen a Derbyshire winter and a 5-year-old boy swinging from her hand and a cloth bag of bread over her shoulder, and she thought that both versions of herself had been afraid, but this one had better shoes for it. The house appeared through the trees the way it always had, not gradually, but all at once, as if it had been waiting behind the last row of elms to make a statement. Grey stone, for stories, the long front windows going amber in the late light. Smoke from 2 chimneys, the kitchen, and one other. Someone was here. Arabella had assumed the house would be empty, or nearly so. She adjusted. She went to the front door because the front door was her door and she was done, she decided in that moment, with letting herself approach anything about this sideways. She raised her hand and knocked, which she understood immediately was an absurd thing to do at the door of your own house, but the alternative was walking straight in and she was not quite there yet. Mrs. Price opened the door. She was older, of course she was older, 6 years is 6 years, but the housekeeper was otherwise entirely the same woman, with her ring of keys and her straight back and the expression of controlled professional competence that Arabella had always suspected concealed a very large heart that was simply too well bred to show itself uninvited. That expression lasted precisely 4 seconds. Then it collapsed entirely. "Your Grace," Mrs. Price said, in a voice that had been stripped of every single layer she used it for. Nothing professional left in it. Nothing controlled. Just a woman seeing something she had spent 6 years believing she would never see again. The title hit Arabella like a wave. She had been Agnes for so long. She had been so thoroughly, habitually Agnes that hearing herself called anything else was briefly incomprehensible. And then, like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been touched in years, it was the most comprehensible thing in the world. "Mrs. Price," Arabella said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "We've had rather a long walk. Might we come in?" She was standing in the entrance hall, breathing it in, the smell of it, beeswax and stone and the faint ghost of wood smoke, when she noticed the Holland covers being removed from the furniture. The new draperies in the sitting room, visible through the open door. The vase of fresh flowers on the hall table, not wild ones, ordered ones. "Who is coming?" she asked. Mrs. Price, who had composed herself with impressive speed, hesitated in a way that was itself an answer of some kind. "His Grace has. There are arrangements," she stopped. Started again. "The house is being prepared, Your Grace." For another stop. Arabella looked at her steadily and waited. "Perhaps," Mrs. Price said carefully, "Your Grace might like to sit down first. I have been walking for 4 miles. I would like to know what is happening in my house." Mrs. Price's jaw tightened slightly. Then she said, with the resigned courage of a woman who had always believed in telling the truth and found it expensive every time, "His Grace is to be married. The announcement was made in the Gazette 4 weeks ago. The lady is expected to visit next week, to begin familiarizing herself with the household." The entrance hall was very quiet. Edmund, who had been examining the Ashford crest on the wall with intense interest, turned around and looked at the 2 adults. Arabella looked at the fresh flowers, the uncovered furniture, the open door of the sitting room, where she could see, if she turned her head slightly, that the portrait above the mantelpiece, her portrait, the one she had sat for at 23, had been turned to face the wall. She crossed the room. She gripped the portrait's frame. She turned it back. Her own face looked out at her from 6 years ago, younger, softer, with an uncertainty in the painted eyes that she didn't remember feeling but apparently the painter had seen anyway. "There," she said quietly. To herself, mostly. To the 23-year-old in the painting. She straightened it until it was exactly level. Then she heard the hoofbeats on the drive. She knew before she reached the door. She could not have explained how. Perhaps it was the way Mrs. Price went very still behind her. Perhaps it was something older than reason, the particular animal awareness of a person who is about to come face to face with the thing they have been both moving toward and dreading for 400 miles of recovered memory. She opened the front door and stepped into the courtyard. The rider came through the last of the elm trees at a trot and pulled up sharply when he saw the door open, and then he saw her, and the horse stopped because the rider's hands went slack on the reins in a way that even a well-trained animal could not entirely ignore. The last of the October light was directly behind him. It caught the dark of his hair and the breadth of his shoulders and the way he sat a horse, the particular way he sat a horse, like someone who had grown up doing it and had never once thought about it, and Arabella's prepared speech, the one she had been composing and discarding and recomposing for the last 4 miles, went completely. He dismounted. She was not certain he was aware of doing it. He let the reins drop, which she knew, from a buried memory of this specific man and this specific habit, meant that whatever was happening in his mind had entirely overwhelmed whatever was happening in his hands, and he stood in the courtyard and looked at her. His face. She had remembered it. She had spent 6 years dreaming the blurred shape of it and then spent the last 2 days with the real version flooding back in. The jaw, the dark hair, the angular lines of a face that had never been comfortable with softness. But the memory had not kept him perfectly. It had not kept the specific look that was on it right now, a look she had never seen there in the 2 years of their marriage. Something cracked open behind the grey eyes that she understood with a sudden terrible clarity was what grief looked like on a man who had spent 6 years learning to keep it out of his face and had just, in one instant, lost the ability. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Then a small, sturdy body pushed past Arabella's skirts and came to stand in the doorway. Edmund looked at the tall man in the courtyard with the focused, judicial attention he brought to everything that required evaluation. He looked at him for a long and thorough moment. Then he held up Captain. "This is my horse," Edmund said. "His name is Captain. Are you lost?" Callum looked down at the boy. Arabella watched it happen. She watched the exact moment his eyes found Edmund's face and understood what they were seeing. The jaw, the nose, and above all the eyes that were the same pale grey as a January morning, the same eyes that looked back at Callum Ashford from his own mirror. She watched something move through him that she had no name for. Something that was not a single emotion but the simultaneous arrival of several that had no right to occupy the same body at the same time. His riding crop fell from his hand. He did not notice. Edmund looked at the dropped crop, looked up at Callum, looked at the crop again, picked it up and held it out, with the matter-of-fact helpfulness of a child who has not yet learned to make anything complicated. Callum took it. His fingers closed around it slowly. His eyes came back up to Arabella's. "Come inside," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She was going to think about that later. "Mrs. Price will have tea." The sitting room had the particular silence of a space that understood something significant was being said within it and was doing its best not to interfere. Mrs. Price had taken Edmund to the kitchen with the decisive efficiency of a woman who had served this family long enough to understand when adults needed a room to themselves, and who had correctly identified that the small boy needed soup more urgently than he needed to witness whatever was about to happen between his parents. Arabella sat in the chair nearest the fire. Callum stood near the window. Neither of them had moved toward the tea. She told him. All of it, beginning to end, the river, waking in the Holloway farmhouse, 6 years of Agnes, the market and the cart horse and the crack of the wheel that broke everything open. She told it plainly and in order, without decoration, because she understood instinctively that this man did not need it shaped for him. He needed the facts. He would feel what he felt about the facts privately, in the way he did everything. He listened with his arms folded and his gaze fixed somewhere slightly to the left of her face, not avoiding her, she thought, but managing the input, taking it in carefully, the way you moved through a room in the dark. When she stopped talking, the fire made a small, domestic sound, a log settling, and the clock on the mantel went on doing its business, and outside the window the last of the October light finished its work and left. "You were alive," Callum said. Not an accusation. Not even quite a question. Something rawer than either, a man holding a fact against the last 6 years of his life to see what it did to the shape of them. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was very controlled and very low. "I identified you by the locket." "I know." She met his eyes. "I gave it to Nell that morning. She was running away. She needed something to pawn." A muscle moved in his jaw. "She was wearing your locket." "Yes." Another silence. Something was working behind his face, behind those grey eyes. She could see it moving without being able to read it, like watching something large shift beneath the surface of deep water. "The boy," he said. "His name is Edmund," she said. "He is 5 years old. He was born the following June, in a farmhouse, and I didn't know I was carrying him when—" her voice did something she hadn't given it permission to do. She steadied it. "I named him Edmund because it was the only name that felt right, and I didn't understand why until 2 days ago." Callum's eyes closed briefly, opened. He looked at the fire. "Your father's name," she said quietly. "I heard you speak of him. I must have held onto it somewhere." He said nothing. He was doing the internal work of a man who had built an entire architecture of grief around a false foundation and was now standing in the rubble of it, trying to understand what any of the pieces were for. Then the door opened and Edmund appeared, with a piece of bread in one hand and Captain in the other, and announced with a full mouth that Mrs. Price made better soup than anyone except Mamma. He looked at Callum. Swallowed. Considered. "You can have some if you want," he offered, with the generosity of someone who has just decided a verdict. "There's plenty." Callum looked at his son for a long, unguarded moment. Something shifted in his face, not a smile exactly, but the memory of one, the muscle movement of a man whose face had forgotten the shape but not entirely the instinct. "Thank you," he said quietly. Edmund nodded, satisfied. "You should sit down," he advised. "You look tired." Arabella pressed her lips together. Callum sat down. It was the most natural thing that had happened in this room in 6 years, and they all three of them knew it without anyone saying so, which was perhaps the most Regency thing about it. Later, much later, after Edmund had been put to bed in a Pembroke guest room for the first time in his life, after Mrs. Price had finally been persuaded to go home for the evening, after Arabella and Callum had existed in the same sitting room for 2 hours in a careful, exhausted, imperfect truce that was not yet peace but was perhaps the ground that peace could eventually be built on, a knock came at the study door. It was the young footman, newly rehired, slightly flustered. He held out a letter on a small salver. "Arrived this afternoon, Your Grace." Forwarded from the London address. Callum took it. The footman retreated. The room was quiet. He looked at the handwriting on the outside. Neat, precise, slanted slightly to the right, the handwriting of someone who had been well educated and took it seriously. He knew the hand. He broke the seal. He read it once. He read it again. The letter was perfectly gracious, perfectly composed, covering 1 page in clear, clean lines. Miss Honoria Bassett, asking, in the pleasant and practical way she had of asking anything, about the timing of her first visit to Pembroke. Looking forward, she wrote, to beginning to understand the household. She signed it with her full name and her regards. Callum folded the letter. He set it in the exact center of the desk. He placed both hands flat on either side of it. Outside the study door, somewhere in the depths of this house that had been silent for 6 years, he could hear Arabella moving, the soft sound of her footsteps on the stone corridor, the small domestic sound of a door. His wife. The woman he had buried. The woman who had come back through his front door this evening with their son on her hip and 6 years of survival written into the set of her shoulders. He looked at Honoria's letter. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he stood, took his coat from the chair, and went to find paper and ink. Because some things could not be done by proxy, and some things could not wait for morning, and what he owed Honoria Bassett was more than a letter, but a letter was where it had to begin. He pressed the nib to the page. And somewhere down the corridor, completely unaware of the letter on the desk or the woman it was addressed to, Arabella Ashford stood in the doorway of her son's room and watched him sleep in a Pembroke bed for the first time, captain clutched in one small fist, his grey eyes shut, his chest rising and falling in the deep unconscious peace that only belongs to children who have been fed and felt safe and had no idea yet how much the world was about to change around them. She rested her head against the doorframe. She had gotten him here. She had done the thing she came to do. What happened next? What she and the grey-eyed man at the end of this corridor were going to build or fail to build from the rubble of a 6-year-old marriage and a 6-year-old lie and one perfectly composed letter from a woman in Bath who had done absolutely nothing wrong, that was tomorrow's work. Tonight she had gotten her son home. That would have to be enough. For now. Morning came to Pembroke the way mornings come to houses that have been asleep too long, slowly, uncertain of its welcome, testing each room before committing to the next. Arabella was already awake when it arrived. She had been awake since 4, sitting at the small writing desk in the guest room they had given her, her old dressing room, she realized, which was either Mrs. Price's idea of discretion or her idea of a gentle suggestion, watching the Derbyshire dark outside the window turn from black to grey to the particular cold blue that came just before dawn. She had not tried to sleep after midnight. There was too much happening behind her eyes, too many pieces of a life reassembling themselves in the dark, finding their edges, pressing together to see what shape they made. She was still sitting there when she heard Callum's door at the end of the corridor open and close at 5:15. She did not move. Neither, after a pause of perhaps 30 seconds, did he. She could feel him on the other side of the wall, or told herself she could, which amounted to the same thing. Then his footsteps moved away down the corridor, down the stairs, and out through the side door into the early morning, and she listened to them go and thought about the letter she had seen on the hall table when Mrs. Price brought up her candle the night before. A letter in a woman's handwriting, sealed and addressed to the Duke of Pembrooke. Left for him to find in the morning. She did not know who it was from. She told herself it was not her business. She was not entirely convinced. Mr. Croft arrived from London by midday, travel-worn and professionally expressionless, summoned by an early morning letter from the Duke that had apparently been written with enough force that the ink had pressed clear through to the blotter on the other side. He came into the Pembroke library, set his document case on the table, looked at Arabella, who was sitting perfectly upright in the chair across from the Duke with her hands folded and her chin level, and said, after a pause that lasted precisely as long as a man of his experience needed to process the impossible, "Your Grace, you are looking remarkably well, all things considered." "Thank you, Mr. Croft," Arabella said. "I am told the same of you." He sat down. He opened his case. He put on his spectacles. And then, with the remarkable composure of a man who had devoted 30 years to remaining useful in situations that defied preparation, he began. The legal picture was, as Callum had anticipated, comprehensively tangled. Arabella's death had been recorded in 3 separate parish registers across 2 counties. Edmund's birth had been registered under the name Holloway with no father listed, because Agnes Holloway had been a widow and everyone in the village understood that to mean something it did not mean. The betrothal notice for the Duke of Pembroke and Miss Honoria Bassett had run in the London Gazette and 2 regional papers. And the entailment, the original problem, the reason Callum had ridden north in the first place, remained technically active until a legitimate heir was formally documented in residence. "The heir," Croft said carefully, making a note, "is present on the premises." "He is in the garden," Arabella said, teaching the head groom the correct way to hold captain. Which is, apparently, with 2 hands and a great deal of respect. Croft looked up from his notes. Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but the careful professional preparation for one. "And captain is a wooden horse." "Of course." He wrote something down. "The entailment resolves itself the moment the heir is formally registered. The rest," he removed his spectacles and polished them, which she had learned was what he did when he was about to say something that required softening. "The rest will require time and patience and a good deal of correspondence with people who will be surprised." "They will not be more surprised than I am," Arabella said. "Quite." He replaced his spectacles. He looked at Callum, who had said almost nothing since Croft's arrival, sitting with his elbows on the arms of his chair and his fingers pressed together in front of his mouth, watching the conversation with the focused quietness of a man processing several things at once. "There is the matter of Miss Bassett," Croft said, carefully. "I am aware," Callum said. "The betrothal has not been legally formalized. There is no binding contract. However, given the public announcement, I will handle it personally." His voice left no room for the conversation to continue in that direction. "Today." Croft nodded. Made another note. He did not ask questions about things that were not his to ask questions about. It was one of the qualities that had kept him employed by the Ashford family for 30 years. When he had gone, the library was very quiet. Arabella was the one who broke the silence, because she had found, over the last 12 hours, that waiting for Callum to break it first was an exercise that required more patience than she currently possessed. "You should go to her today," she said. "Don't send a letter. She deserves better than a letter." He looked at her. "You're telling me how to handle it." "I'm telling you what's right. You can do with that what you like." She stood and moved toward the door. She did nothing wrong, Callum. Whatever this costs her, she should not have to read it in someone else's handwriting. She was at the doorway when he said her name. Not Agnes. Not Your Grace. Her name. The real one, that she had not heard spoken in this specific voice for 6 years, and hearing it now did something to the back of her knees that she declined to show him. She turned. He was still in his chair, still with that contained, measured look, but something in it had shifted slightly. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I came back for Edmund." She left before he could respond to that. But she heard him exhale behind her, long and slow and careful, and she thought about that exhale for the rest of the morning. He rode out at 2 o'clock and came back at 6, and whatever had happened in between he kept to himself. But he was quieter at supper than he had been at breakfast, which was impressive given that he had been extremely quiet at breakfast, and when Edmund asked him at the table whether he had been somewhere interesting, Callum looked at the boy for a moment and said, "I went to speak with someone who deserved to be spoken with." Edmund considered this with a mouthful of bread. "Was she nice?" Callum paused. "Yes," he said. "She was." Edmund nodded. "Captain says nice people should be told they're nice. He says most people forget." Callum looked at the wooden horse propped against Edmund's water glass. "Captain," he said gravely, "appears to have a very developed ethical framework for a horse of his size." Edmund beamed. Arabella looked at her plate and allowed herself precisely 3 seconds of something that felt dangerously like hope before she put it away. The days that followed had a texture unlike anything Arabella could have predicted. Not comfortable exactly, not yet, but real. The way a healing wound is real, unmistakable in every moment, impossible to forget about but proof that something is working. They were careful with each other. Almost too careful, in the way of two people who understood that carelessness had consequences. But carefully was still together, and together was something they had not been in 6 years, and Arabella discovered that she had more capacity for patience than she had previously credited herself with. Edmund had no such patience and no interest in acquiring it. He began including Callum in things with the calm, complete certainty of a boy who had decided a verdict and saw no reason to wait for anyone else to catch up. He showed him Captain. He showed him the remarkable stone he had found by the gate. He appeared at Callum's study door one morning and informed him that Mrs. Price said the estate had a proper fishing pond and that he, Edmund, had never been fishing, which seemed to him like a significant problem that someone should address. Callum, who had been halfway through a letter to his London steward, set down his pen. He looked at this small, serious person in his doorway. He said, "I see." "Captain has also never been fishing," Edmund added, in case this strengthened the argument. There was a pause. Then Callum said, "We'll go Thursday," and picked up his pen again. Edmund turned and walked away with the complete satisfaction of someone who has never doubted the outcome of a negotiation. Arabella, passing in the corridor and having heard all of it through the open door, kept walking and said nothing. She stood at the end of the corridor and pressed her back against the stone wall and breathed for a moment. Because it was one thing to come home. It was another thing entirely to watch home become something it had never quite been in the first place.
If you've made it this far, you already know this story has you hooked. Go ahead and give it a like right now, subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and who's your favorite character so far. We are only halfway through and things are about to get considerably more dangerous, so don't go anywhere.
The rose garden was Arabella's. She could not have said exactly when it became hers again, only that she found herself drawn to it each afternoon regardless of the weather, pulling on her plain work gloves and attacking the overgrowth with the focused energy of someone who needed something physical to do with feelings that were too large and too complicated to simply sit with. The roses had been badly neglected, 6 years of no one caring, but the roots were still there, strong and deep and stubbornly alive beneath the tangle of dead wood. She understood that more than was comfortable. She was cutting back a particularly resistant cane one afternoon when she heard the garden gate and looked up to find Callum coming through it. He had been for a ride, his coat was wind-rumpled, his hair worse, and he stopped when he saw her, as if he had not been expecting her there, though she suspected he had known exactly where she was. "The north side needs cutting back," he said, looking at the roses. "I know. I'm getting to it." He came and crouched down beside the bed she was working on, examining the root structure in the way a man examines something when he needs a reason to be in a place without stating the reason. "You always liked the garden," he said, after a moment. "Did I?" It came out more sharply than she intended. She moderated it. "I'm still remembering things. Some of it comes back clearly. Some of it I have to be told." He was quiet. Then, "You used to come out here in the early morning before anyone was awake. I saw you from the upstairs window once. You were talking to the roses." She looked at him. "You never told me you'd seen that." "I didn't know how to." He met her eyes briefly, then looked back at the root ball. "I was not," he stopped. Restarted, with the deliberate care of someone choosing a harder and more honest word. I was not present in this marriage before. He said it the way he had said it the night of her return, with the directness of a man who had apparently spent 6 years deciding to say it clearly if he ever got the chance. I gave you a house and a title and very little of myself. I told myself it was the appropriate arrangement and I was wrong. Arabella sat back on her heels. She looked at him. That's quite an admission, she said. It's the truth. I know it is. I'm just noting that it took you 6 years and a cliff to get there. Something moved in his face. Not quite a wince. The near cousin of one. Yes, he said. That's fair. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been a stranger she married at 22 and a ghost she dreamed about for 6 years and was now something more complicated than either. I was frightened of you, she said. When we were first married. Not of anything you did. You were never cruel. But you were so closed. I never knew what you were thinking. I never knew if I was, she paused, finding the word. Adequate. The word sat in the garden between them. You were, he said quietly. You were more than adequate. And I was too foolish to say so while I had the chance. She turned back to the roses. Clipped a dead cane. Let the silence work. Ask me something, she said, not looking at him. He frowned slightly. What? Ask me something. Something real. We have been having very careful conversations for 4 days and I am tired of careful. Ask me something you actually want to know. He was quiet for a moment. She thought perhaps he would default to careful anyway. It was so deeply built into him. Then he said, Were you happy? As Agnes. Were you actually happy? She considered it honestly, because he had asked honestly. Some of it was genuinely good, she said. The Holloways. Edmund. She set down the shears. But there was always something missing. A shape where something should have been. I told myself it was just the strangeness of having no history. But I think now it was something more specific than that. She looked at him. I think I missed you. Without knowing who I was missing. The garden was very quiet. Callum looked at her the way she had seen him look at Edmund on Thursday by the fishing pond, with an expression she had no existing name for, one that his face seemed to be making for the first time. Arabella, he said. Don't, she said gently. Not yet. We have a great deal of ground to cover before we arrive at whatever you're about to say. Give us time. He closed his mouth. Nodded. And for the first time, she saw that it was not coldness that lived behind his reserve. It was discipline. The very effortful, very long-practiced discipline of a man who felt a great deal and had spent his entire life deciding it was safer not to. 6 years of grief had cracked it open. She was looking at what was underneath. It was not what she had expected. It was considerably more. It was Mrs. Price who mentioned Fenwick. Not on purpose. She said it in the natural course of discussing the household accounts, a question about the quarter's expenses, a reference to Mr. Fenwick's records from the previous period, and she said it in the easy, accustomed way of someone referring to a name that was simply part of the furniture. Arabella stopped. Mr. Fenwick, she said. Silas Fenwick. Mrs. Price looked up. Yes, Your Grace. He was rehired when we began reopening the house. His Grace's London office arranged it. He's been managing the... He is here. It was not a question. Arabella's voice had gone very flat. In this house. Now. He was here this morning. He'll be back Thursday for the... Mrs. Price stopped. She was watching Arabella's face. Your Grace. Are you quite all right? Arabella set down her tea. She thought about the morning of the carriage journey. The chocolate that had tasted strange. The dizziness on the cliff road. The way Fenwick had been standing at the bottom of the front steps when she came down. She could see it now, clearly, his smile, that impeccable professional smile that never reached his eyes, and the way he had pressed the cup into her hands and said for the road, Your Grace, it's a cold morning. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the entrance hall the day she arrived. 2 seconds. Just 2 seconds of something behind those pale eyes before the mask rebuilt itself. He had known. He had looked at her and known immediately, and said nothing, and continued to manage this house with his ledgers and his clean fingernails and his professional smile. "The ledgers," Arabella said, very quietly. "The estate accounts from 1809 and 1810. Where are they kept?" She found them in the library cabinet, 3rd shelf, behind the current household records. She found them with the ease of someone who had, in a previous life, spent enough time in this room to know where things were kept. She carried them to the desk. She opened the first one. She had been an embroiderer, a watercolorist, a reader of novels, a grower of roses. She had never been trained in accounts. But 6 years of managing a farm's finances, the Holloway's figures, the annual ledger that old Mr. Holloway had eventually handed to Agnes because she was better at it than any of them, had given her an education that no finishing school in England offered. She read the Pembroke accounts for 1809 and 1810 with the focused patience of a woman who knew what she was looking for and was no longer surprised by anything. She found the first discrepancy inside 20 minutes. Then another. And another. Small ones at first, the kind that looked like rounding errors and weren't, and then, as the year progressed in the ledger's pages, larger ones. Payments to names she didn't recognize. Transfers between accounts with no notation. Supply invoices for quantities of goods that no house this size could have consumed. Fenwick had been stealing from the Ashford estate for, she turned back to the earliest entries, calculating, at minimum, 5 years before the carriage accident. Possibly longer. Modest amounts at first, growing steadily as he apparently concluded that no one was checking closely enough to notice. She had noticed. She had noticed in October of 1810, and she had written a letter to her own solicitor, and she had been going to post it in Derbyshire, and Fenwick had known. The cold that moved through her then had nothing to do with the unlit fireplace. She sat very still at the library desk with 6 years of a man's careful, patient theft arranged before her and thought about a cup of chocolate on a cold October morning. She thought about the taste of it. She thought about how quickly the dizziness had come, and how she had assumed it was travel nerves, because who would believe anything else? She reached back to replace the first ledger and her hand found something behind the false panel at the rear of the cabinet drawer. Something small. She would not have known the panel was there at all except that she had hidden things there herself once, at 23, when the house felt too large and too observed and she needed somewhere that was only hers. It was a letter. Folded small, tied with a dark ribbon. She untied it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. The handwriting inside was not Fenwick's. It was tighter, more cramped, a correspondent's hand. It was addressed to him, and it was dated the 3rd of October, 1810. 9 days before the carriage went over the cliff. She read it. She read it twice. It was not long. It did not need to be. It concerned itself, in the clipped, transactional language of men engaged in very cold business, with the problem and its proposed resolution. The problem was named, with Fenwick's characteristic efficiency, as the Duchess's knowledge of certain accounts. The resolution involved the Derbyshire journey, the cliff road, and a phrase, it must appear entirely natural, that Arabella read and then had to set down for a moment and breathe. It must appear entirely natural. She sat in the library of her own house, in the last light of the afternoon, and understood completely and finally what had happened to her on that road 6 years ago. Not an accident. Not misfortune. Not a wet road and a startled horse and the particular cruelty of random chance. A decision. Made in a ledger room somewhere, by a man who was currently 2 corridors away and possessed a key to every room in this building. The door opened. She did not move. She did not look up. She heard the footstep, 1, 2, pausing, and she knew, from the weight of them, that it was not Callum. Not Mrs. Price. She closed her fingers very slowly around the letter. Your Grace. Fenwick's voice was exactly as it had always been. Smooth as river water. Entirely without surface. Mrs. Price said you were looking for the household accounts. If you need assistance with anything. No, Arabella said. She looked up. She met his eyes. And she watched him see, in her face, exactly how much she had found. The mask held. She had to give him that. It held longer than she expected, that benign professional composure that had served him for 30 years. But underneath it, something was happening. Something small and cold and calculating, behind those pale eyes, working out the geometry of what she knew and what he could still manage. "I was just leaving," she said, and stood, and tucked the letter into her sleeve with the smooth, unhurried movement of a woman who had decided that the next thing she needed to do was find her husband. She walked to the door. He stepped aside for her. He had to, there was no other choice, and she passed within 2 feet of him and felt the cold that came off a person when they have done an unforgivable thing and would do it again tomorrow if the circumstances required it. She did not let herself walk faster until she was around the first corner and out of his line of sight. Then she picked up her skirts and she ran. Callum was in the study. He looked up when she came through the door without knocking, which she had not done before now, and something in her face brought him to his feet before she had taken 2 steps into the room. She crossed to the desk. She put the letter down in front of him. She said, "Read this." He read it. She watched his face as he did. She watched the same progression she had gone through herself, the understanding that built slowly and then arrived all at once, the particular horror of it, the moment when it stopped being just numbers in a ledger and became something that had been done to a person. She watched his jaw set. She watched his hands, those broad, capable hands, flatten against the desk on either side of the letter. He looked up. She had been afraid, before this moment, of what she would see in his face when he knew. She had worried that it would be disbelief, that he would look at Fenwick's 30 years of reliable service and look at her 6 months of recovered memory and weigh them against each other and choose what was comfortable over what was true. What she saw instead was something that moved through his grey eyes like weather. "He's still in this house," Callum said. Very quietly. "He's in the library." Callum straightened. He picked up the letter. He folded it with a precision that was somehow more frightening than anger. He put it in his coat pocket. "Callum." "He will not be in the library much longer," he said, and his voice was so absolutely controlled, so absolutely level, that it was the most frightening thing she had heard in a room full of frightening realizations. He walked past her toward the door. "Callum." She caught his arm. He stopped. She looked at him, this man who had come back to a shuttered house to make a decision and instead found a wife, a son, and a 6-year-old attempted murder. "Don't do anything that puts you on the wrong side of this. He belongs to the magistrate, not to you." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something in him that had been moving very fast went very still. "You're right," he said, after a moment. "I usually am," she said. "It simply took us a while to establish that." Something happened in his expression then, quick, involuntary, real. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. Here and gone before either of them could decide what to do with it. "Stay with Edmund," he said. She let go of his arm. He went to find Fenwick. And she went to find her son. And somewhere in the walls of Pembroke Manor, 30 years of careful, patient, lethal deception began, at last, to come apart. The study door was open. Fenwick saw that first, the open door, the light from inside falling across the corridor flagstones, and he paused at the threshold the way a man pauses when he is calculating whether there is still a move available to him. His ledger was under his arm. His face was assembled into its usual expression of helpful attentiveness. He had had 4 minutes since the Duchess left the library to decide what he knew and what he could still deny, and 4 minutes was usually enough for a man of his particular experience. He stepped into the study. Callum was standing behind the desk. Not sitting, standing, with his hands behind his back and his weight perfectly distributed and his face doing absolutely nothing. He was looking at a point just past Fenwick's left shoulder with the fixed, patient attention of a man who has already decided the outcome of the next 10 minutes and is simply waiting for them to conclude. On the desk between them sat the letter. Fenwick looked at it. He looked at Callum. He made one final calculation. "Your Grace," he began, in the smooth, unhurried voice that had managed 30 years of difficult conversations. "I believe there may be some confusion regarding—" "Sit down, Silas." The use of his first name was so unexpected that Fenwick sat before he had decided to. Callum had never, in 30 years, called him by his Christian name. It was the sound of a rule being discarded, and the discarding of rules by men in positions of absolute authority was never a reassuring sign. Callum came around the desk. He did not sit. He stood with the letter in his hand, and he looked at Fenwick the way a man looks at something he is measuring for a specific purpose, and the silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of pressure. "I'm going to tell you what I know," Callum said. "And then you are going to tell me the rest. Not because I'm asking. Because by the time I've finished what I know, you'll understand that the rest is simply a matter of deciding how you'd like to spend the next 30 years. Fenwick's hands were folded in his lap. "Your Grace." "The accounts first." Callum set the letter down and picked up the ledger that Arabella had left on the desk. He opened it to the first marked page. He turned it toward Fenwick. "This entry. September, 1808. £40 to a G. Marsh with no corresponding notation in the supply register. Explain it." A pause. "That would be," Fenwick began. "Don't." Callum turned the page. "This one. November, 1808. £65. March, 1809, 112. He looked up. The amounts increase. Silas. Gradually enough that someone checking carelessly would not notice the progression. But my wife was not checking carelessly. He closed the ledger. She found this in October of 1810. She wrote a letter to her solicitor. She was taking that letter to Derbyshire to post it. He picked up the letter from the correspondent. "And you knew." The mask came down. Not all at once. Fenwick was too practiced for that, but in pieces, like a wall taking water. The professional pleasantness receded. What was underneath was not monstrous. It was something worse than monstrous. It was ordinary. A man who had made a series of reasonable-feeling decisions, each one building on the last, until he had arrived somewhere he had not planned to go and found he could not back out. "She would have ruined me," Fenwick said. His voice was still level. That was the remarkable thing. 30 years. 30 years of service, and one discovery would have ended every bit of it. I would have been prosecuted. I would have lost everything. "So would she," Callum said. "Her life, Silas. She lost her life. She survived. She survived a river in October after going over a cliff road in a drugged carriage. She survived by luck and a farming family and 6 years of having no idea who she was." Callum's voice did not rise. It went in the opposite direction, lower, quieter, more deliberate with every word. "She raised my son in a farmhouse because you decided your 30 years of theft were worth more than her life." The room was very still. Fenwick looked at the desk. Something moved through his face, not guilt exactly, but the near cousin of it, the thing that arrives when a man finally stops calculating and simply sees. "I didn't know she was with child," he said. "No," Callum said. "I don't imagine you did." He crossed to the door and pulled it open. The young footman was waiting in the corridor, had been waiting, Arabella would later understand, since Callum had put his head out and quietly requested him there 5 minutes before Fenwick arrived. 2 men from the estate were behind him, steady and local and entirely accustomed to following the Duke's instructions without requiring explanations. "Mr. Fenwick will need his coat," Callum said. "The magistrate is expecting him." Fenwick stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Callum one last time, and whatever he saw there, whatever had been 30 years in the making, he did not attempt to speak to it. He walked to the door. He went with the 2 estate men without resistance, because there was no resistance left in him. The calculation was finally over and the answer had come back wrong, the way it always does when the ledger includes things that cannot be entered in columns. Callum stood at the study window and watched them cross the courtyard below. His hands, he noticed, were completely still. 3 days passed. The magistrate came and went. Papers were signed. Mr. Croft returned from London with more papers, which were also signed. Edmund caught 2 fish at the pond on Thursday, one of which was immediately released on Captain's advice, and informed Callum at supper that he was, in Edmund's considered opinion, a tolerable fisherman who would improve with practice. "High praise," Arabella said. "The highest he gives," Callum agreed, and the ease of the exchange, the ordinary, domestic ease of it, 2 people speaking across a table about a child they had made together, caught them both slightly off guard. They looked at each other and then looked away, and the moment passed, but it left something behind. A residue of what normal could feel like, given time. It was on the fourth morning that the unexpected carriage came through the gate. Arabella was in the rose garden. She heard the wheels on the drive and looked up, and through the garden gate she could see the vehicle. Plain, well kept, no family crest on the door. A woman stepped out. Tall. Blonde. A pale blue travelling coat, not a single detail out of place. Arabella set down her shears. She had known, in an abstract way, that this moment was coming. She had not known it would arrive on a Tuesday morning with no warning, while she was in her work gloves with mud on her hem. She pulled off the gloves. She smoothed her dress. She walked to the garden gate. Honoria Bassett saw her coming and stopped walking. They stood 10 feet apart on the gravel drive and looked at each other for a moment that had no comfortable shape. "I should have written first," Honoria said. "I was halfway here before I realized. I apologize." "Don't," Arabella said. "Please come in." Mrs. Price, displaying the tactical genius that 6 decades of life and 30 years of service had given her, produced tea in the sitting room and vanished so completely that she might have been conjured and then dispelled. Callum, who had apparently also heard the carriage, appeared in the doorway, took in the 2 women, made a rapid assessment, and said, "I'll be in the study," with the self-preserving instinct of a man who understood that some conversations required his complete absence. Arabella almost liked him for it. She and Honoria sat across from each other with the tea between them, and neither of them immediately reached for it, because tea was something you did while the conversation settled, and the conversation had not settled yet. Honoria looked at the room with the open, assessing gaze of a woman who had been imagining it and was now measuring the imagining against the reality. She looked at the portrait above the mantelpiece, Arabella's portrait, facing out, slightly crooked because Arabella never had quite straightened it level. She looked at the child's muddy boot print on the hearthrug that Mrs. Price had not yet managed to remove. She looked at the white roses in the vase on the table, late-season ones, slightly blown. Then she looked at Arabella. "I came," Honoria said, "because I wrote you a letter and then decided that a letter was a coward's choice and I am not a coward." She paused. "Usually." "What did the letter say?" "That I wished you well. That I was glad the boy had his name." She picked up her tea. Set it down again without drinking. "That I hoped," she stopped. Started again, in the deliberate way of someone who has practiced a speech and found it inadequate. "I had a very clear understanding of what I was agreeing to, when I accepted his offer. I knew he did not love me. I told myself that was workable. That honesty and shared purpose were sufficient foundations." She looked at the roses. "I believe I was correct about that, actually. As a general principle. I simply had the misfortune of being correct in a situation where the specific facts made it irrelevant." Arabella looked at this woman, this composed, clear-eyed, quietly remarkable woman who had walked into a ready-made heartbreak with open eyes and handled every part of it with more grace than most people managed in comfortable circumstances. "I'm sorry," Arabella said, "for the position this put you in." "You went over a cliff," Honoria said. "I don't think you owe me an apology. I owe you an acknowledgement, at least, of what it cost you." Honoria was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, somewhere in the direction of the stables, Edmund's voice drifted across the courtyard. He was explaining something to the groom with considerable authority. A faint involuntary smile moved across Honoria's face and was gone. "He sounds like a person of strong opinions," she said. "He gets it honestly." Arabella paused. From both sides, as it turns out. Honoria looked at her. Something shifted between them, a small, significant thing, like a lock deciding to open. "Are you happy?" Honoria asked. "To be back." Arabella considered it, the real answer, not the convenient one. "I'm still deciding what back means," she said honestly. "The house is familiar and strange at the same time. The man at the end of the corridor is, not who I remember, and also exactly who I remember. And I find I have feelings about both of those things simultaneously, which is inconvenient," Honoria offered. "Exhausting," Arabella said. Honoria laughed. A real one, brief and genuine, and Arabella felt something loosen in the room. They drank their tea. They talked, haltingly at first, and then more easily, in the way of two people who discover that the thing they feared about each other is not actually there. Honoria asked about the Holloways. Arabella told her about Mrs. Holloway's bread and the farm and Edmund's first word, which had been a mispronunciation of captain that had briefly sounded like something impolite. Honoria told her about Bath and her younger sister's relentless romanticism and the very small, very dull dinners that constituted social life when one was neither quite engaged nor quite free. When she rose to go, she paused in the doorway and turned back. "I shall be quite all right," she said. Not for Arabella's reassurance, it came out like a statement of intent, something said aloud to make it binding. "I want you to know that. I am not a person who falls apart." "I know," Arabella said. "I can see that quite clearly." Honoria nodded once. She went to the front door. She stopped there, with her hand on the frame, looking at the drive, the elm trees, the pale October sky. Edmund came around the corner of the house at full speed with mud on both knees and Captain extended toward her. "He wants to say goodbye," Edmund said. He had apparently decided that Honoria was a person worthy of Captain's farewell, which was not an honor he extended to everyone. Honoria crouched down. She took Captain very seriously, examining him with the focused attention of someone assessing a dignitary. "He is," she said gravely, "an exceptionally fine horse." Edmund's face broke into a full, unhesitating smile. He took Captain back, tucked him under his arm, and said, "You can visit him again if you want." Something in Honoria's face went briefly unguarded. Then she stood, smoothed her coat, and walked to her carriage. She did not look back this time. But she was smiling. Faintly, privately, in the way of someone who has been given an unexpected small thing exactly when they needed one. The house was quiet that evening. Edmund asleep. Mrs. Price gone home. The fire in the sitting room burning low. Arabella did not go to bed. She sat in the chair nearest the fire and read nothing and thought about everything. Honoria's carriage disappearing through the gate, Fenwick's face when the mask finally came down, Edmund's smile on the hearthrug at dinner, Callum saying she was alive in a voice that still lived somewhere in her chest. She heard him before she saw him, the particular weight of his footstep on the stone corridor, the pause outside the sitting room door. He knocked, which she thought was both unnecessary and very him. "Come in," she said. He came in. He looked at the chair across from hers, and she made a small gesture, and he Saturday. They had been doing this careful, deliberate, imperfect sitting together in the evenings, since the second night. Neither of them had named it. Neither of them wanted to. "Croft wrote," Callum said. "Fenwick has made a full confession to the magistrate. The embezzlement, the letter, the carriage." He paused. "All of it." Arabella looked at the fire. "Good," she said. "Then, I thought I would feel more, when I finally knew it for certain. I thought I would be," she searched for the word, "angrier." "Are you not angry?" "I am. Somewhere underneath. But mostly I feel," she looked at her hands. "I feel as though a door has closed on something. The 6 years, the accident, all of it. As if it has been gathered up and put somewhere I can put a lock on." She looked at him. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes sense," he said. "It means you're done with it." "I'm done with it," she agreed. The fire shifted. The clock on the mantel continued its patient business. Callum leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely linked. He was looking at the fire. His profile in the firelight was exactly as she remembered it from the portrait of him in the upstairs gallery. The strong jaw, the sharp edge of his nose, and also entirely different, because the painting had not caught the way 6 years of grief had settled into the lines around his eyes. She was glad the painter had not caught it. It felt like it belonged to now. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it." He looked at her. "I spent 6 years convinced that the problem with my marriage was its abrupt ending. That if I had had more time, I would have become better at it. More present." He paused. "I understand now that I was not entirely wrong about the better at it part and entirely wrong about it requiring death to achieve it. That is," another pause. The careful choosing of words, which she was coming to understand, was not coldness but the opposite. An attempt to be precise about things that mattered. That is something I have to live with. That I wasted the time I had. Callum. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm not. He stopped. Started again. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that I am aware of it. And because I would like, if you're willing, the chance to not waste whatever time we have now. The fire. The clock. The particular quality of silence that a house makes at night when it is inhabited again after long emptiness, a settling and breathing sound, as if the walls are remembering what they are for. Arabella looked at this man who had come back to a shuttered house to make a decision and had found his entire life waiting for him inside it. I told you to ask me in the spring, she said. You did. It is not the spring. No, he agreed. It isn't. Nevertheless. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to give you an answer tonight, because I find that I am done waiting for the correct season to say true things. She folded her hands in her lap. I do not know yet if we can be what we should have been. I cannot promise you that. 6 years it changes a person. I am not 22, and you are not whoever that man was who stood at the bottom of our staircase and did not know how to speak to me. She held his gaze. But I am willing to find out what we can be. The two people we are now, in this house, with that child asleep upstairs. She paused. That is what I'm offering. Not a return. A beginning. Callum was very still. The kind of stillness that was the opposite of emptiness. A beginning, he said carefully, with reasonable expectations on both sides and the understanding that you will be required, going forward, to say things out loud instead of keeping them locked in some internal study that no one else has access to. Something moved across his face. Unstoppable, this time. That is a very specific condition. I have had 6 years of not knowing what you were thinking. I am not going back to that. No, he said quietly. Nor am I. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. And between them in the firelight was the specific charged stillness of two people who have finally, after everything, said the actual thing. He reached across and covered her hand with his. He did not grip it. He simply placed his hand over hers, deliberate and careful, the way you put a hand on something you are not certain you are allowed to want. She turned her hand over underneath his and laced her fingers through. They sat like that by the dying fire for a long time. Not speaking. Not needing to. Outside the sitting room window, the Derbyshire night was cold and completely clear, the kind of clear that only came after sustained difficulty, every star visible, the kind of sky that made you understand why people had always read things into it. Hope. Direction. The quiet insistence of light across an enormous distance. November came to Pembroke the way it always had, indifferent to whatever had happened in October. Edmund discovered that the estate had a second pond, smaller than the first and murkier, which he declared superior on grounds he was unable to fully articulate but felt strongly about. He also discovered that the library contained illustrated volumes on natural history that he could occupy himself with for extraordinary lengths of time, provided someone left him alone with a biscuit and adequate candles. He had taken, with the ease of water finding its level, to the house. To Mrs. Price, who slipped him biscuits at strategic intervals. To the groom, who let him name one of the mares. To the library and the fishing pond and the stone-flagged kitchen and the corridors that were sized, as he observed to Arabella with 5-year-old matter-of-factness, for considerably larger people than him. And to Callum, quietly, incrementally, in the way children choose their people, which is not by grand gesture but by accumulation of small moments. A game of chess that Edmund watched from the arm of the chair until Callum moved his bishop incorrectly and Edmund, who had been paying closer attention than anyone knew, told him so. A morning when Edmund appeared beside him on the front step at 6 o'clock while Callum waited for his horse, and simply stood there, not speaking, watching the park until the groom came round, and then went back inside without explanation, apparently satisfied. A question, asked at supper one evening without preamble, "Will we stay here now?" At Pembroke. Callum had looked at Edmund, had looked at Arabella, had said, "Yes, if you're agreeable." Edmund had looked at Captain, had apparently received an affirmative response. "Captain says yes," he reported. "And Captain is usually right." "Then it's decided," Callum said. It was the last morning of November when Arabella came out to the rose garden and found Edmund there. He had not told anyone he was going. She had looked in the library, the biscuit gone, the natural history book open and abandoned, and then checked the stable yard, and then followed a 5-year-old's instinct to the one place she should have looked first. He was crouched at the base of the first rose bed, doing something methodical and careful with a piece of burlap. He looked up when she appeared at the gate. "Thomas said the frost is coming tonight," Edmund said. "He said if you don't cover the roots, they won't come back in spring." "Who is Thomas?" "The undergardener. He knows about roots." Edmund turned back to the rosebush, tucking the burlap under with focused, particular attention. "I told him I would help." Arabella came through the gate. She stood for a moment just watching him, this small, serious person who carried Captain under one arm even while doing this, who had been born in a farmhouse and was now covering the roses of a dukedom with the same uncomplicated devotion he brought to everything he decided mattered. She heard the garden gate behind her. She did not need to turn. Callum came to stand beside her. He looked at Edmund. He said nothing. "He's been out here half an hour," Arabella said quietly. "I know. I saw him go past the study window." He paused. "I thought about stopping him. Then I thought," he stopped. "What?" "That he knows what he's doing." They stood together at the edge of the rose garden and watched their son tuck a Duchess roses in for winter with a 5-year-old seriousness and a wooden horse tucked under his arm, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment had not already said more cleanly. Edmund looked up. He saw them both standing there in the gate together. He raised Captain briefly in greeting. Then he went back to the roses. Callum's hand found Arabella's at their sides. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. They both looked at Edmund, and the morning light on the grey stone walls of Pembroke Manor, and the late-season roses being carefully, patiently put to bed by a boy who understood, with no one having to explain it, that what you protect in November is what comes back to you in spring. The gate stayed open behind them. The house breathed. And somewhere down the corridor, on a desk that had once held a letter from a woman in Bath and before that 6 years of unanswered grief, a fresh page waited, white and clean and entirely unwritten, which is the only way anything worth having ever begins.
If this story held you from the first word to the last, if you felt every reunion, every revelation, every moment in that rose garden, then please give this video a like right now. It genuinely makes a difference. Subscribe if you haven't already, because more stories like this are coming and you do not want to miss them. Be sure to leave a comment telling me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the courtyard? The letter? Or was it Edmund and Captain covering the roses? I read every single one. Thank you for staying till the very end. Until next time.